What's up, gang? Thanks for joining Bang Bang, a show obsessed with war movies but with an anti-imperial twist. I'm Van Jackson, and Lyle, you are...
I am Lyle Rubin.
Nice. Welcome to us both. I thought about a tagline that was like, fuck war before war fucks you, but I don't know if that's too intense, and we hadn't discussed it, so we'll
Works for me.
saved rounds.
Sounds about right.
So I guess since this is the first episode, we're going to be talking about a movie this week, Combat Obscura. This was your pick, and there's much to say, but we probably need to kind of introduce ourselves first and the theory of the show, like what we're doing here. What's your background?
So I was a Marine for 5 years. I got in 2006. It's a complicated story, but I was enlisted for about a year and a half. I became an officer and served as an officer about 3.5 years. And I was in Afghanistan for almost all of 2010, going into early 2011, which was the height of the Obama surge. I was a Marine, so I was mostly operating in and around Helmand province. I was a signals intelligence officer, and got out 2011. Got involved with left politics basically right out of the gate. Occupy was happening then, and I ended up becoming a graduate student. Got a doctorate in history at University of Rochester. Wrote a book called Pain is Weakness Leaving the Body. It's a military memoir of sorts. I think that sums it up for now.
And you've been on my other show, the Undiplomatic Podcast, where we talked about the book, and your book won an award, so you can call it award-winning. It's okay.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to self-brand as needed. It wasn't. I'm happy for it's the Society for Military History. I never thought I would get an award from them, but I was honored to get a distinguished medal award from them, and yeah, now for the rest of my life, I can say I'm a award-winning author.
Yeah. And then just me quickly, when I was 17, I ran away from home to join the Air Force. And I wanted to be a spy. I didn't know what that meant. And so I ended up working in Air Force intelligence. They trained me up to be a Korean linguist. I'm not Korean, Filipino. And, and yeah, I was against the Iraq War while I was in uniform. This is like 2000 to 2006. So I get out of the military around the time you get in the military. And I end up going to work for a management consulting firm, which was like a nightmare. I'm going to grad school at night. Eventually, I get my PhD, work my way into the Obama administration, and I work as a civilian official in the Pentagon in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And there's a lot more that I'll probably unpack as the episodes go on. But by the time Trump comes to office, I'm sort of moving left quickly and pretty alienated by like the Washington sort of national security establishment. And yeah, now I think war is for fucking suckers. It enriches the few at the expense of the many, and I was part of the many. And so yeah, I'm all about sort of like telling war to fuck off. And that kind of brings us to this show and the mind meld with you, Lyle. So how would we describe what we're doing with this show? I mean, what's the goal here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it might be helpful to like emphasize what we're not doing and who we aren't. So
Good starting point.
There's a lot of hardened combat veterans, or people market themselves as hardened combat veterans that write their own books or have their own podcasts. Like, I mean, just speaking for myself, I'm not one of those people. I have a combat action ribbon because I got vaguely shot at once in a foot patrol, but I saw minimal combat. And even if I had seen more combat, I don't think I'm the kind of person that would want to double down on that kind of history and all the rest. I'm much more interested in kind of just understanding the culture of the military, and even more importantly, the political culture that surrounds the military and to a large degree has inspired our military. and also, directed our military toward all sorts of ends that I think both of us agree have not only been unwise and counterproductive, but pretty horrific and indefensible. And this has gone on for decades, arguably centuries. It's a central part of the American story. I think we both, aside from being very skeptical of the wars that we were in one way or another involved in, and war in general, I think we both have something of an anti-imperialist critique. What we're trying to do here is kind of read U.S. empire and U.S. power in the world through popular culture, through movies, through cinema.
And we're kind of, in a way, we're meeting people where they are, because everybody has A Few Good Men and Full Metal Jacket and like all these films as a touchstone in their memory banks. And for our generation, we grew up on this shit. I mean, like, I didn't I didn't know anything about the military except what I could glean from films, and so it kind of like colored our imagination, and film itself about, movies about war, whether they're good or bad or heroic or dystopian or whatever, like they're always refracting the culture. And I think the culture, that this is the critique in your memoir that I kind of like mind melded with, was like, the culture is militarist, the culture is really violent, and that those themes are bound up with other themes that you talk about a lot, that I've come to recognize are like permeating a lot of these films, which is sex and death, domination, and like at a certain point, in some ways, violence for the sake of it. So we'll get to all that, I guess, because those things and more come out of this fucking film, Combat Obscura. So, I mean, you want to get to it, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go.
All right.
Let's roll.
Let's roll. Bang bang. So, all right. Oh, do you want to explain Bang Bang real quick? The like, double
Yeah.
entendre?
So both of us, we were going back and forth brainstorming, and I think we both agreed pretty early on in the process that we wanted a name that was explicitly war related or violence related, but also kind of had like a sexual double entendre of some kind or innuendo of some kind, because we both agree, having served time in the military, that military life and war is hypersexualized. I mean, it's just all around you. It's unavoidable. Almost every manner in which we speak about war within the military is just like openly sexual, and virile, and all the rest. So Bang Bang, has a kind of sexual component to it as well.
Yep. Violence and sex. Okay. So, shit. Combat Obscura documentary. I'd say more than half of the films on our list are, fictional, but there are a bunch of docs too. And this was like this movie, I guess, comes out in 2018. Miles Lagoze is the director. He was enlisted Marine, combat cameraman. I mean, what can you tell us about combat cameraman? What can you tell us about why you chose this thing, Combat Obscura?
Yeah, I mean, I chose it for pretty selfish reasons. Miles was, I mean, I don't know him personally, so maybe I should call him Lagoze, but he was in Afghanistan basically like right after I left. His deployment was, I believe, most of or all of 2011 or most of 2011 going into 2012. So it's kind of like the second half of the Obama surge. From what I can tell, he spent most of his time in Kajaki and Sangin. I spent,
It's in Helmand, right?
yeah, they're both in Helmand, northern Helmand, or mid to northern Helmand. And I spent some real time in Sangin, did some foot patrols there. I'm sorry, not in Sangin, in Kajaki. I also went to Sangin. My guys patrolled there. That was really like the most violent spot. during my deployment. I was supposed to go off on a foot patrol, and then my own unit pulled us out of the foot patrol the very morning when we were about to step out. So thankfully, I never had to actually, go beyond the wire and sing it, because the unit that we were working with, they lost 25 of their guys. It was one of the most hard hit units in the whole history of the Afghanistan war. But anyways, Lagoze was there, and he was going out on patrols and seemingly pretty significant operations. And as you can see from watching the movie, I mean, he caught a lot of pretty intense footage, but also a lot of kind of unexpected footage, beyond the actual combat, that I think is really, really interesting. And as far as like all the movies I've seen that have come out of the Afghanistan war, it definitely speaks the most to both my own experience and then the way that I've kind of responded to that experience. I think, Lagoze, it's very subtle. He doesn't really, he goes out of his way not to intervene as a narrator. So that you hardly hear him at all throughout the entire documentary. But still, I mean, a lot of the editing choices that he makes are clearly deliberate, and in my mind, very powerful and very honest and true.
Yeah, the film has like a ton of restraint, and that the power of it comes from those restrained choices, like not to put a dub track over with his voice, not to like put himself into the frame of the camera and all that shit. But yeah, I mean, so this was his first film as a combat cameraman. He's basically like a propagandist. He's wearing the uniform. He's a Marine, but his job is to like film units for PR purposes that will get aired in the Chow Hall or up on CNN or whatever. And there's a backstory. We should have asked him to be on this episode, actually, now that I think about it. But
we should invite him to a future. I mean,
he's
I
a
don't know
natural guest.
He actually, I mean, he came out with a new book recently, his first book, called Whistles from the Graveyard, I believe. It was well
memoir
received
about
by,
all this.
yeah, like Sebastian Younger gave like a really good blurb, and the whole like standard crew of military memoirist types. I think Elliot Ackerman, others. Apparently, I'm kind of interested in reading it myself, but maybe we could have him on. We could talk about his book too.
Yeah, no, we'll reach out to him. Miles Lagoze, if you ever hear this, come on the show. You're welcome. Bang bang. So first film, it was critically acclaimed in the sense that like it got a ton of press. The Intercept, the Daily Beast, Hollywood Reporter, New Yorker, like a lot of coverage. Most of it favorable. On Rotten Tomatoes, 100%. That's not a lot of films that hit that. And I mean, box office wise, it kind of didn't exist. I looked up, I found it made $10,000 at the box office. So not.
Yeah, and there were also like legal issues, because he had used footage, that he had acquired as a combat cameraman. So as in service of the Department of Defense. And at first, I believe they tried to sue him, but they ended up withdrawing the lawsuit or whatever it was. And I think that might have possibly, I'm not sure. Maybe he can speak to the details on this, but that might have gotten in the way of it being, shown in really like theaters across the country. I would say that it was like very well received among, a relatively elite circle of critics and military people. But in my mind, it never received the kind of broad appeal or awareness that I think it should, which is one of the reasons I'm happy we're doing this, because I want to get the word out.
Yeah, no, totally. It was, I mean, I read a little bit about the backstory the legal troubles, because it's like he filmed this shit while he was a Marine for the Marine Corps. It's their intellectual property, basically, right?
Yep.
Property of the state. And then he had to go through some declassification process to get access to it after he got out. So the footage is from 2011, 2012. So just on the heels of when you were there. And then in 2013, he gets out of the military and he goes to study film at Columbia. And then this is in 2018. I guess he was processing the film or some shit, getting it declassified during that time. But 2018, he has the film in hand or the footage in hand, and then he's chopping it up and producing it while he's a film student, and then it comes out that year. So, and then the way I've learned about this recently, it's a longer story. Documentaries, the way they sort of like succeed or make money or whatever, is mostly not in the box office. Like it's hard. I mean, you don't see a lot of docs at the local Cineplex or whatever. So you take your documentary to film festivals, which are sort of scattered all over the world. You show it at the film festival. You hope that it wins an award at that festival, and then if you get an award or a nomination or something, you bank that as part of your PR as you push it to other film festivals. And you're doing this because every time you go to a film festival and show it, you're like punching a lottery ticket in hopes that like the right distributor or buyer sees it and wants it. And that's how you get it sometimes into the theater, but mostly you get it onto streaming. And so I don't know how you watch this. I watched it on like Amazon Prime or whatever the fuck.
YouTube, man.
Oh, it's on YouTube.
Yeah.
God damn it! I paid for this.
Well, you're giving, hopefully that money is getting to Lagoze.
Hopefully,
But,
yeah.
I'm sure it's not, but we let a man dream.
Yeah. So like, but a ton of documentary. I made a shitty documentary a few years ago. Like, a lot of them don't end up on streaming. It's hard to get it on streaming, and then once you get it on streaming, it's actually kind of grim because it's very hard to get anybody's attention on streaming. So like Netflix, Amazon, whatever, they only put so many little advertising cards up on your screen as a user, and they're never going to put up some obscure documentary unless it like won an Oscar or some shit. So once it goes on to streaming, it kind of disappears forever. And so your big hope is like getting favorable press coverage, winning awards, shit like that. And then when a distributor picks it up or a streaming service picks it up, you get whatever money they're willing to pay for it up front, which is often not a ton of money, but you're hoping it's enough to like cover whatever costs you had to pay to make it in the first place, at least. And then you go on to the next one. So that's the industry, so not surprising that there's no box office piece to this, but the fact that it's on Amazon suggests to me that it was like somewhat successful, plus the favorable reviews from critics, which is like not a bad thing. What about this movie grabbed you? Was it just that the experience was like reflective of your experience in this same place and time, basically? Was it something artful about it? I mean, like what's the grab here? I think you like the movie, yes? I mean, I thought it was good.
I think, like I said, I mean, I would say that it's, in my mind, the most truthful film about the Afghanistan war to come out. And I think the most evocative film to come out. And, when you ask like what grabbed me, I mean, the very first few moments of the movie grabbed me. It's kind of interspersing, and he does this throughout the movie. And by the way, I should say like another thing that we're not, when I was talking about like what we're not, I mean, neither of us are film critics. We're not. There's a lot of like film critic podcasts out there. We're just two dudes. So for anyone who's like
literally two dudes, yes.
Yeah. So if there's any like film critics out there, people that consider themselves aficionados, we're not that. We apologize in advance. But going back
critics, not film critics. Yeah.
But it just, I mean, he intersperses, different scene. One scene bleeds into the other, and I think that's, I deliberately use that term, bleeding into the other, because even like the non-combat scenes, you can almost sense the bleeding.
Mm-hmm.
And then he's constantly going from combat to non-combat, and yet they're all kind of like part of this same moment, the same singular moment. And you see that right off the bat. I mean, there's some guy shooting down range. You don't really know what's going on, and then it cuts to these kids. I mean, because people often forget that people that haven't been in the military, don't think a lot about these questions, forget that it's kids that are on the front lines.
Yeah.
These kids in a tent, rapping. And I mean, that hit me hard because it's been years since I've been out, and I got a PhD, and I've kind of the farther I've been away from my actual experience, the more I tend to intellectualize everything. And that first scene of just being in that tent with those guys, I felt like I was back with those guys. I mean, I like that scene. Like you see so much of exactly that. And, like, I'm sure, Van, you see that you had similar experiences, but like that exact scene of being in a tent and just like these kids just like freestyling or whatever the hell they were doing, like that happens all the time. And I think that really gets at like, one aspect of military life and life on the front lines, or just like life in a war zone. On the imperial side, you've got laptops. I mean, if you're on a remote outpost somewhere, you're probably not going to have internet, but you can still play this or that. There's something really endearing about that. These kids, uh, you know, uh, doing the hip hop, but then like again, it's being interspersed with some kind of combat of some kind, and as you see very quickly, like that good spiritedness kind of curdles as the movie progresses. You get less and less of that, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I think like the first 15-20 minutes, you get a lot of like just laugh out loud humor. And I think as at least the way I experience it, as the documentary evolves and progresses, you see less of that, you feel less of that, and you get more and more lost in just the total lethal insanity of it all.
Yeah, in the beginning, there's a taste, especially with the little freestyle cipher in the tent. Like, there's a taste of good humor and camaraderie and that like bonhomie, like that vibe is so strong. I noticed at one point, like unironically, they were referring to each other as comrades, and they meant it in the most like literal sense, and when someone eventually does take a bullet in the towards the end, spoiler alert, towards the end of the film, it happens for stupid ass like needless avoidable reasons, but the response of their comrades are literally like, I fucking love you, man, and they're trying to do what they can for each other. But in the beginning, the freestyle thing, I thought it was so like they're cutting up, they're laughing their asses off while they're doing a horrible job at freestyling. And then the thing that um, interjected was a fucking explosion from outside, and you see them all like freeze for a second, and then a couple of them like kind of jumped, and then immediately they go back to fucking like laughing at the guys who jumped because they got scared by the explosion for a half second. And like that's then they're cutting up about that, and like they think that shit is like so funny. And so and then there's lots of cut tos in this film where like the contrast cuts, like you're saying. So it goes from the funny to the boom boom or bang bang, like right away. It's pretty. The editing choices were like very smart. Speaks a lot. Speaks volumes.
Yeah, no, again, I think it was a very like subtly done film, which is my favorite kind of film, my favorite kind of entertainment or art. I prefer, and we'll be talking about a lot of movies that are not so subtle, and sometimes that can be fun too. But you know, even though I'm not a film critic, the wannabe film critic in me very much admires the subtlety of the documentary and the choices that he makes throughout. And you see that right from the beginning. So yeah, like, I mean, if you want, we could just kind of like walk through some of those moments that really hit us.
Yeah, like what vignettes or whatever stood out, or like quotes, moments, whatever.
So, like, first of all, that initial scene, I think it's the initial scene. It's one of the initial scenes. Um, they're, they're firing down range. I'm not exactly sure. It looks like they're using like I'm not exactly sure what weapon they're using. It's been years since I've been in. I don't want to get it wrong, but maybe like an AT-4 or maybe a javelin or something. I'm not exactly sure, but
yeah, they don't explain it anyway. Like, it just
yeah,
happens.
yeah. But like you hear this guy goes and says, or multiple guys are saying, "That's the wrong building." Actually, this is like the first scene. That's the wrong building. Yeah, boy.
And then like, they fucking like love it.
Yeah. He knows it's the wrong building, and he gets excited anyway. And they're all like, "Yeah, boy!" And like that's something. Even though I didn't see like what I consider a lot of combat in the sense, like there were very few times where, other than like just being terrified of stepping on an IED, which is where I was. There weren't a lot of firefights. It was mostly just stepping on IEDs or being in a vehicle that lands on an IED. But one thing I did experience a lot was that those scenes just like that, where you're like, either we were on like a small outpost or we were in some kind of operation where we were in a mud hut compound of some kind, and we were firing out from that compound. And I saw a lot of that where the Marines are so excited, and I mean, we sure as hell were missing. I mean, I shouldn't say I wasn't pulling the trigger, but they were missing, and a lot of times it was unclear if anyone really knew who or what we were actually firing at. And yet that didn't at all get in the way of the excitement and the adrenaline rush, which is really at the time all that mattered. And there's a real kind of honesty, I think, to that scene right in the beginning. Like, they know they're hitting the wrong building. They have no idea who's in that wrong building. And they're still kind of celebrating that moment.
So that appeared repeatedly throughout the film. This like, we think of like Vietnam War type stuff where it's the soldier goes through trauma and then you witness the trauma and then there's some kind of like learning because of the trauma, and so that like cycle, it's not that it's not there. Like, these guys clearly have fucking trauma of all sorts packed in, but it's not in that, like, it's not quite like the woe is me empathy thing of like the Vietnam soldier. It's like these guys literally were describing firefights as the best thing. Like, one guy said it was better than skydiving. His dream was to combine firefights and sex. He said that,
He actually said he says firefights are better than skydiving. Maybe better than sex. Maybe if you combine skydiving with sex, maybe it would be as good as firefights. But even then, probably not.
Like,
again, like that kind of like just dark, bitter, but also just like combat loving humor, and like is just like it's so pervasive, and it's, as much as I fucking hate like what I took part in, and as much as I hate myself for taking part in it, I still look back nostalgically and fondly at that kind of, to use a word you used earlier, but like a bonhomie, camaraderie, and just like kind of just, totally like without pretense, like this honest humor, and I don't want to make it seem like everything they say and everything they do is honest, because a lot of it isn't. I mean, we see a lot of scenes where they're clearly performing. I saw one of Lagoze's interviews, and he made a good point, which is that they were like performing for him, throughout.
Yeah.
Like he wasn't just this kind of passive outside observer. I mean, he was very much part of the scenes that, in a way, he was creating by virtue of having that camera with him that was on. And and so a lot of what they're saying and doing is performative. They're, in a way, they're playing out these parts that a lot of us have become familiar with through pop culture, through movies, through TV shows, through video gaming. But in a way, like, even that, the performativity, that doesn't make it any less honest. I mean, there's a truthfulness to that performativity. Like, that's so much of military culture is performing. And guys, they love the performance. I mean, they
It's very like present. And visceral at the same time, like, in that embodied feeling of being in the moment, and especially when your mortality is uncertain. I feel like I'm over intellectualizing this, but like, that's a thing. That's a real feeling. That's part of what it means to be honest sometimes, and just because it's honest doesn't mean that that's like vindicating of what they're doing or something. But it is what it is. Yeah. Honestly, smoking a lot of weed. That was surprising about this. I had heard stories that dudes who went down range smoked up a lot. I didn't know that it was like an obvious conventional wisdom truth kind of thing. I thought it was like something on the down low that like very few people did.
Yeah, so I mean, I knew guys who were smoking a ton of hash. Because I was an officer, no one ever did it in front of me, but I knew it was happening. Some of my guys would tell me it was happening, in one way or another. But and then there was also, like, I mean, there was an incident when I first showed up. There were some guys that died from trying to. I think they tried to smoke like opium, because you have all these.
Yeah.
They ended up dying, and it wasn't refined or wasn't properly. I mean, I don't
know how it works.
Yeah, I don't know how it works either, but they were killed, and I would hear stuff about people. It wasn't just hash. I mean, they were making use of poppy, and they were also, when I first showed up, we were working with the DEA, and they were raiding actual, like, refining locations. So, like, there was, like, my understanding is that there were some frontline troops that were getting hold of, like, refined opium. And I would see needles. I mean, there were a lot of, like, Afghan ANA, Afghan army soldiers that were, like, shooting up. And, and there was never, I don't think, like a totally hard line between what the Afghan army guys were using and what the Marines were using. Like, if I were to guess, I would think it was mostly hash that the Marines were using, but I'm sure at times it wasn't just the hash.
I don't want to get on a political economy tangent, but like, correct me if you have a better understanding of this. My understanding was like one of the many contradictions in Afghanistan going on was that opium production and export even was like a major cash crop for the economy overall. But part of our, quote unquote, stabilization of the country and like nation building was to choke off opium production. No?
Yeah. I mean, the throughout the war, it was very schizophrenic. Both the military brass and the political leaders were going back and forth on what exactly the strategy should be. So when I showed up, if I remember correctly, it was kind of like the tail end of, like, actually burning the crops and really trying to, like, go after what we saw as the source of capital for the Taliban, which was profits from opium production and opium dissemination. And but that always backfired because the more we warred against the Taliban, and the more we burned their major cash crop, the more the people, fled into the arms of the Taliban and other insurgent groups.
That's how they're making a
And,
living. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And the more empowered they became, and the more incentivized they became to, and I'm talking about the Taliban here, the more incentivized they became to invest even more in poppy production, because they needed more capital to fight, the increasing amount of troops and
Yeah.
and all the rest. So it was, I mean, this is like a common thing at this point, but it wasn't so well known at the time. But poppy production skyrocketed like throughout the war, precisely at the time when we were going to war with poppy production. And this is, I mean, there's been so many books written about the connections between drugs, heroin in particular, cocaine as well, and our our foreign policy and our wars. I'm not as well read on that stuff than other people. I don't know if you are either, but
Nope.
this is like very much like another chapter in that very, very long book of drugs and war.
Yeah. One other thing on the strategy point, which is, I mean, this is not the only time we'll be talking about fucking Afghanistan. Obviously, like, 20% of the movies are about this inglorious period. But I read in a like background piece where Lagoze did an interview with, I can't remember who, but like one of these places that gave his film coverage. He said something like, in Helmand province, there was a dam, and it provided electric, like hydroelectric power to the province,
That's
and it
the
was
Kajaki Dam. Yeah.
yeah, and it was Taliban controlled, and so part of why there was so much violence there was because he said the units that he was with, their purpose, they were not told their actual purpose. They didn't know that they had to seize control of this dam, that they had to displace the Taliban in order to get the dam, because the dam was the source of hydroelectric power for the province. They didn't fucking know that. So like there's this operational objective that wouldn't change, you take control of it, that doesn't change the direction of the counterinsurgency or whatever, but it is an objective. At least it's definable and concrete, and the units that are being tasked with it don't know this. Like they're taking bullets and going on patrol and hunting for Taliban, and they don't understand why. Like he said, he found this out later, and so like that's kind of fucked up. Like the
Yeah, I
units
mean,
downrange.
even as an officer, and I was like a pretty like curious officer that was trying to read up as much on the context and history of the places that I was serving in, and I was also an intelligence officer, so I was getting that kind of baseline education, and even I at times wasn't entirely clear on what the strategy was at any
As an
given
intel
moment.
guy, not
Yes,
being, yeah,
yes, and a lot
same.
of times
I was
they
an intel guy in the
actually,
Air Force.
yeah, and a lot of times I was clear to the extent that I knew that the strategy was incoherent and contradictory depending on which base I was at, or which outpost I was at, or which operation I was involved with, or my guys were involved with at any given moment. But I mean, yeah, if I remember correctly, and I'm almost like ashamed that I don't remember this anymore, but we had control of the Kajaki Dam in 2010. I mean, my guys were stationed. I had a team at the top of one of the major hilltops there. I mean, it's basically like a massive sand dune. I mean, there was real rocks on this mountain, but it was just surrounded by desert, and it's absolutely beautiful reservoir. And it is a hydroelectric dam, so that it's the reservoir that was giving power. And I believe the operation was we had to clear the highway, or what was I don't know if you could call it a highway, but clear this route. It was so much of the operation then was clearing this route to get one of the major components of the hydroelectric dam you know, to Kajaki, if I remember correctly. So you had a lot of Marines that were getting killed or doing the killing, all across this route. And I think Sangin was very much part of that mission, that broader mission. By the time I left in early 2007, like that was still happening. Like we hadn't succeeded yet in all this. So that's at least how I remember it. I might be misremembering. But yeah, I mean, Kajaki, I was there multiple times. And, like I said, I went on a few foot patrols. And the village, I mean, it was really bizarre. I remember the time that I actually got my combat action ribbon, like, I felt there was a part of me that wanted to go on these foot patrols just for the same reason anyone else wanted to go on them. I wanted to experience combat. I wanted to say that I experienced combat. I wanted the combat action ribbon, all the kind of like ignorable reasons why you go on these things. But there was a part of me that, my guys were going out on these foot patrols on a regular basis. And I felt like the least I can do is go out with them on one of them. So they didn't just see me as this kind of distant, remote officer that was giving them orders without ever having his own skin in the game.
Mm-hmm.
And
how often were officers out on patrol with their units?
I mean, the infantry officers were, if they were good infantry officers, I would say that they were. They were out there quite a lot with their guys. I would say the majority of the patrols are not with the officer. Like the majority are with the squad leader. But if it's like a platoon level operation, yeah, definitely their officer is going to be out there with them. And then occasionally the officer will be out there for, attached to like a squad level patrol or operation of some kind. Signals intel, I was a SIGINT guy. And when I was out there, I was like one of the first, me and the other SIGINT officer that was operating in the southern part of Helmand province. We were like the first SIGINT officers in a while to actually like go out on patrols. For a long time in our units, that was considered like a no.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, it went back and forth, but anyways, Kajaki was weird because you would basically go out on these foot patrols, and every time you would know, I mean, these were minefields. So like a lot of times IEDs would go off and people get killed or severely wounded. And I saw plenty of medevacs from a safe distance whenever these IEDs would go off. The patrols I went on, thankfully, neither myself nor any of my Marines nor anyone else on the patrol ever landed on an IED. But with Kajaki, you always knew that you were going to get fired at some point. And this is kind of like one of the reasons people would go to Kajaki. And again, this is like something I'm so like ashamed about now, but you would go to Kajaki so you could go out on one of these foot patrols and get fired at. And then you could get your combat action ribbon. So it was almost like the way I described it at the time and the way we all described it was like an amusement park ride. It was like a ride. If you have your ticket, you get to go out on the ride. And at the time, like, again, it was like mostly IEDs that people were getting hurt and killed on. But the firefights themselves were like relatively minimal. Like we had all the control. We had a number of big guns. I was with actually an artillery unit. So they had like, I forget what it's called, but it's like 155 or God, I used to know all this stuff. But it's like their big artillery gun, which was on the top of one of the hills on the base. And the moment these guys from this small little village, this mud hut compound would start firing at us, we would, we'd fire. Again, I never pulled the trigger. I was a SIGINT officer. Like all the other guys in the platoon started firing back. But then we'd have like an artillery gun firing back. And we even called in the squad leader I was with, called in an airstrike. And we were like just behind these trees, these bushes for hours waiting for the airstrike. And then the airstrike got called off because it was precisely at a time when there was finally some media scrutiny about how many civilians we were killing. And basically, I believe this is after, if I remember correctly, this is after McChrystal got replaced by Petraeus. But there was, at that time, they were kind of trying to pull back the reins a little bit. So while everyone on that patrol wanted to see it, to call it an airstrike and just see this compound just get totally obliterated, there were higher ups that intervened, thankfully, and made sure that didn't happen.
I remember when you were on my show, the other show, Undiplomatic Podcast, like to do your book, you said something I will never forget, which is that war is a bully's game. And you were talking about the technological superiority of American forces, which you guys were not free from danger. Like anytime you're in a combat setting, you're of course exposed to risk, but the balance of risk, like the relative risk that you guys face versus what the Taliban faced, or even the Afghan National Army, it doesn't even compare. You've got medics embedded, you've got medevacs, you've got air dominance, uncontested, it's a permissive environment for air superiority, like you've got better weapons, bigger weapons, like you're controlling the grid in like strategic choke points and everything. Like you have military superiority in like most meaningful respects. And that makes it a bully's game, I don't know. That stuck with me. It reminded me when you were talking about this just now. Do you still hold to that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, from my perspective, like I said, I saw minimal combat. Obviously, the guys that were seeing intense combat, which I would say included some of, a lot of the units that Lagoze was with.
Yeah.
They would rightly probably object to that and say that at times, at least, it was more of a fair fight. Certainly some of the scenes in that movie implies it's more of a fair fight. I mean, it was basically guys with, M4s fighting guys with AK-47s, at least at times. And then the enemy had the recoilless rifle, which was, somewhat fair, kind of counterpart to the AT4 and some of the other things that we had. But yeah, for the most part, there's no doubt that if you look at the war from like a bird's eye perspective, certainly from my perspective, like, I mean, it was outrageous, like what was really happening on a day-to-day basis. I mean, these were poor ass farmers who had very little food, very little clothing, very little money, very little weaponry. To the extent that there was a real danger in the area of operations that I operated in and that my guys operated in, again, it was the IEDs, more than anything. And that was another thing I found interesting about Combat Obscura is at times you had guys, there was that one really interesting scene where I wrote it down, but you had this guy, I think it was the same guy who talked about like firefights being better than sex and better than skydiving.
Yeah.
But he said, like, he actually said, I haven't really gotten to see a lot of, experience a lot of firefights here. Like, it's mostly just, they're cowards. He called them cowards. They just like lay down their IEDs and then we step on them. And, there was like one of those interesting moments where it was like so truthful and then also was kind of like missing, a truth at the same time. Right. Like, and I think
you want your enemy to fight you in the way that like that either shows your manhood or that like where you have an advantage,
Yeah. And he's talking about like these guys that are like laying down these IEDs. Like, I mean, the risk they're taking in just laying down those IEDs is like tremendous.
Yeah.
These same guys that are laying down these IEDs are very much engaging in firefights. Maybe not where he was at that given moment, but at other times. And I mean, they're constantly getting whatever villages that they're operating in, whatever compounds they're operating in, they're constantly getting patrolled. Like, we're constantly patrolling those areas, we're constantly raiding those areas. And again, they're like, even though the airstrike that I talked about got called off, there were plenty of airstrikes, plenty of artillery shells going downrange. So like, these guys were not, they were the farthest thing from cowards. And I think even that guy, like, I hope he survived the war, but I'm sure if he did survive the war, at least based on all the Marines I served with, I think most of them now get it, when they talk about the people we were fighting, they have, at least, the ones I know, have more respect for them than maybe a lot of them had at the time. And obviously there's a lot of like complicated emotions that are happening. I mean, it's these guys that are killing their friends, or almost killing their friends, or almost killing them. But I like, when I was in Afghanistan for about a year, I went to a lot of different like outposts and a lot of kind of areas that they operated in, and I just came across a wide range of opinions on the people we were fighting. At times it was very much like, fuck these fucking cowards. They need to come out. We're coming out. They're not coming out. You heard a lot of that. But I also did hear guys that were getting hit really hard that was saying like, sir, I respect these guys. Like, they're, they don't have the kind of gear we have. They don't have the Air Force that we have. They don't have the big guns like we have, and they're putting their whole life on the line. So you heard stuff like that too.
Something I wanted to ask you related to this was like, how much was there a sense of like siege or paranoia about Red, about the enemy? Because there's all these scenes cut throughout of the film where it's like, the patrol guy is like screaming at little kids, waving guns at them, being like, "Where's the fucking Taliban? Where's the fucking Taliban?" And then like there's a scene where they kill an Afghan guy and they go over to inspect the body. They turn over his corpse and they're like, just like a deer. And then they look at the guy and they go, "Oh shit, he doesn't have a gun, does he?" And
we
then
killed
like,
the shopkeeper.
"Yeah, we killed the shopkeeper, didn't we?" And then they're like, "We need to get rid of the body and hide it."
I actually missed that part. I missed that part.
Wait, miss it like you did? You forgot, or miss it like you?
No, I didn't. I didn't catch them actually saying we need to hide it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, man. I because I was an officer, I just didn't. Yeah, I would hear rumors. I mean, I would hear stories like that all the time. In fact, like every location I went to, I would hear a story like that. Oh yeah, these guys went out recently. Or my own guys would tell me, like, they went out, and at times I'd be like, shit, like, we have to report this, but there was never, for me anyway, there was never like hard evidence.
Mm-hmm.
And to be honest, like, even if I thought there was hard evidence, like, how would I go about bringing this up the chain of the command? Would it be worth it in the end? Like, would it be worth it for me? I mean, I would be targeted by the entire institution that I'm a part of. I would lose all respect from my Marines. I would get removed from my billet, which would cause.
And that would be technically for doing the right thing in terms of reporting incidents, inadvertent casualties, that kind of thing.
Yeah, but like, I mean, the classic case of this is obviously, the My Lai massacre, and
Vietnam,
yeah, and like those soldiers that came forward, they got penalized, and even the helicopter pilot that intervened and stopped a lot of the villagers from getting killed, his career. Oh wow, that was a huge thunderbolt. Speaking of,
it sounded like a fucking explosion, dude.
Yeah. Could you hear it on your side?
Yeah, it sounded like it's a little explosion, dude.
Yeah. So that was fitting. There'll probably be more of those.
Wow.
But like, I mean, the helicopter pilot. I mean, his career ended up getting like cut short because
Mhm.
of what he did. I mean, and that's just like a very common story. And where I was, like, if I had tried to like, bring up some of the information I heard, and like ask for like an investigation or whatever, I mean, I would become ostracized immediately. Everyone would fucking hate my guts. They would all deny whatever it is that I was concerned about. The best case scenario is some low level, some enlisted guy after years of military tribunals or the legal process. Some enlisted guy ends up going to prison and their life is over, and they're unemployable. Is there any point at which anything I were to say, or anything I demanded an investigation for, is there any point in which that would have affected any of the actual top level decision makers? No, of course not.
Mhm.
So these are the types of things that were running through my head all the time. And you rationalize. I mean, I told myself at the time, every time that I'd come across something like that, and even times like when I watched, like I told you, I watched Marines firing down range, and it was clear no one really knew what we were firing at, and we knew that there were civilians in the area.
Mhm.
Even then, I was telling myself convenient narratives for why there's nothing I can do about this.
Yeah.
I don't really know what's going on downrange. Maybe these guys that are firing know more than I do. I just showed up on this base, this outpost. So like, there's
You
a
can't
lot
just
of
tell everybody what's what when you're the new guy yourself.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I'm not infantry. I'm not combat arms. So, yeah, there was a lot of that going on. But when you were talking about like the kids and like yelling at the kids, and that scene where the old man is, they're giving him orders. They have the linguist with them, or the terp with them, and they're
The
having him
walkie-talkie
give
thing.
orders to
Yeah.
like basically get totally butt naked. I saw a lot of that. There was actually the patrol that I went out in Kajaki. I saw exactly that. It was exactly the same thing. It was a farmer who was trying to get from point A to point B. We had him, totally undressed, with our weapons pointed, or the other guy's weapons pointed directly at him, screaming at him. You had kids that were sitting there. It almost looked like I was there in that exact scene with those kids and screaming at the kids. And I saw that a lot of that.
It's so unreal. It's like exactly taking it into fantasy world. Like that's how like stormtroopers occupied peripheries in the galaxy. Like it's literally like the epitome of empire, to walk around with guns and then demand things of the locals that emasculate them, embarrass them, subjugate them, literally in the most direct sense. It's actual domination, direct. And it's like that's what's going on. That's whatever you think the larger purpose is here, that's what's happening.
Yeah, if there's like one point I would love to bang home about both this movie and just about like imperial warfare in general, like the bloodshed's terrible, the death is terrible, like the physical destruction is terrible. But the most decisive thing about imperial domination is not the bombs going off. It's not firing down range. It's moments like that. It's the everyday humiliations. Maybe we call them the everyday small humiliations, but those are not small humiliations for these people. That's their entire life, is constantly being yelled at by these people that don't even speak their language, with guns being pointed directly at their fucking heads, telling them to take off all their clothes, constantly being, brought into, being interrogated, or being slapped around or beaten. And I just like, there's one thing I would love Americans to get, like, it would be that. Like, imagine yourself in that situation. What would you do?
I
And
said that to my wife. I was like, dude, if they were doing this shit to me, if some occupying force came in and was like making me pull my fucking pants down out in the street, or like forcibly scanning my eyes and patting me down and coming into my house and shit, I'd be hatching plans. I don't know if I'd be a suicide bomber, but like I'd be doing everything I can to support whatever force is fighting back against this. You know, you're my enemy now. Like that's how this works, dude. And like the fact that we can like perpetuate that kind of system of violence and like not get it is our detriment. I mean, that's doom, man. Yeah. Fucking imperial violence. Oh God. I forgot what I was gonna say. That's like so fucking emotional. There was a time in the film where a guy goes, "This is the point where you just blow everything up. It's not worth it. Just shoot everything, blow every damn thing up around here. They'll get the idea."
Yeah. Yeah, I wrote down that quote too. I think there was more to it too.
But it was that thing of like, you just want to do the violence. You're frustrated. You're not having sex. You know, like they cut to a guy's humping a porno magazine. You know, like literally physically has the magazine. He's like, I just want to fuck. Like,
oh yeah, no, I mean, again, that was another one of those moments where it's like, man, I miss these guys. Like,
I remember those kinds of feelings, you know, and I wasn't even in combat.
Yeah, I mean, like we said, I mean, war is just so infused with sex, and that scene where he's fucking the magazine.
I just want to fuck.
Yeah, and he wants to fuck, but he also wants to fight. You know, he wants to get some, and get some itself is a term that means both fucking and fucking someone up.
Bang bang, man.
Yeah. So yeah, he actually says, so the quote you're talking about, I have it here. He says, this is the point when you just blow everything up. It's not worth it. It's interesting. There's a kind of contradiction there, right? He's like, you blow everything up, even though it's not worth it. Just shoot everything. They'll get the idea. So if they get the idea, then it is worth it, right? But he knows somewhere, I mean, this is that kind of like that. There's something so truthful about that lie, right? Because it's a lie that this is going to work, that they'll get the idea. Of course, at some level, he knows that they're not going to get the idea. In fact, his whole time during this deployment, they haven't gotten the idea, right? So
it's not a strategy. He's not saying a strategy. He's saying what he feels, which is not logical, you know?
Yeah. But, you know, but you still, like, if you're in that situation, like, you've been tasked with an impossible task, a mission that just cannot, the idea that we are going to bring these people to heal is a fantasy. And the more you try to bring them to heal, the more they're going to resist you. At some level, he knows all that, right?
Yeah.
But he's still, at this point, the only vindication, and not even vindication, the only justification for him being there at that point is getting some, right? Like, the mission's fucked. He knows it's fucked.
Yeah.
But at least I can get some. So that's basically what he's saying there. And you see that just across the board with everyone on the front lines. One other thing I want to talk about, because I know we've been going on for a while and we probably want to
technically we've only talked about that opening scene, but we're just freestyling ourselves, so that's fine.
Yeah, this is, you know, forgive us, bear with us as we learn how to do this show. Well, we've talked about a few other scenes, but
we're just jumping around. That's fine.
So in the spirit of talking about different scenes, well, first of all, I don't know if it's the same guy, but someone says, this is another great moment. He says, Afghanistan is a beautiful country, beautiful people. And then there's like a ... moment. And he says, this country fucking smells like shit. I fucking hate it. That's it. And I just love that because, you know, you have all these asshole big time reporters that, like, New York Times reporters, Washington Post reporters, that go to like these countries that were like absolutely devastating. And they'll always say something like that. Like, they'll either say it like, you know, during their actual newscasts, or they'll say it in their books or their interviews. They'll say, yeah, such and such a place is so beautiful. The people are so beautiful. And it's just, there's something so like oily and gross about that.
It's like
And
orientalizing in a way too. Like, yeah.
well, it's definitely orientalizing, and it's like it's so on the nose. The Orientalism is so on the nose, and I love this frontline Marine who's mocking it. Maybe he doesn't, maybe he wouldn't put it in the words I just put it in, but that's what he's mocking. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, I just thought that was just so again just so truthful. Man, there's so many scenes I want to talk about. The other thing I want to talk about that is kind of similar is they have the scene where they're interviewing the officer, the captain, and he's at the soccer game. They have this soccer game that they've sponsored with the local nationals. That term local
Freshman
national,
minds.
it gets me every time, the local, which is like the most bureaucratic, antiseptic term ever to describe these actual human beings. But he's talking about like, yeah, we like to have this soccer game where we bring these local nationals together and trying to let them know that we're on their side or whatever he said.
Yeah.
And you see the kids kind of playing in the background. And then it cuts to another like incredibly violent scene after that. Yeah, I thought that was also really well done. Man, just so many good scenes that I want to go through, but I know we're probably running out of time.
Yeah, I mean, just a couple more thoughts, I guess. Like, there was one quote where one of the guys goes, and I wonder how much this reflects your own experience. Like, he goes, "You joined the Marine Corps. You think the Marine Corps is a bunch of perfect people, squared away killers who don't do anything bad, don't curse." First of all, what the fuck is he thinking? Like, that seems. Does people go in thinking that? But like
Yeah. No, I have more thoughts about that, but yeah.
and then he just to finish I can't even finish the quote because it's like too crazy. But then he goes, "The Marine Corps is actually filled up with the most fucked up individuals I've ever met, just like me."
I think that scene might happen like halfway through. I'm not sure, but I feel like that's kind of like the crowning moment of the whole movie. Is when and it's all night vision. That's, if I remember correctly, that's
Yeah.
like night. He has all these scenes that are like night vision goggle, NVG,
Mhm.
green imagery. Yeah, and as far as he says, like people think we're perfect or whatever, like that's a major part of the conditioning that you go through. It's just
Mhm.
very, again, just so schizophrenic, where you're learning to like unleash your absolutely most vile desires and passions, both to fuck and kill at every moment. And then on the other hand, you're getting just like endless spiels and speeches and lectures about like how disciplined we all are and how we display the highest virtues of American society. And some of that does kind of trickle down to the culture of a lot of like military towns or military communities. Like they
Mhm.
really do believe this stuff, that like at least they say they believe it. Those that serve are just like these incredibly, hyper virtuous, hyper disciplined, hyper noble figures. So I think that's what he's reacting to there. I think at some extent, like, yeah, obviously, like if you watch any war movies, just like existing in our culture, that Marines swear.
I
Obviously
know,
he
like, what
knows
the
that.
fuck? Yeah.
Yeah. So like, I think he's high. Not everything he's saying
Just
is making
talking
any
shit.
sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's shooting the shit. But like but when he took, what he's really saying there is like when it's kind of like beautiful country, that beautiful country moment. It's the same thing where it's like, man, like this is all total bullshit. We're all fucking crazy. We're all fucked up. A lot of us were fucked up before we joined. That's why we joined.
Yeah.
The military is taking advantage of how fucked up we are. They're exploiting our fucked upness so that we'll do more fucked up things on the front lines so that they can make more money back home. I mean, again, I don't want to put words in this guy's mouth. Like, I don't know what his politics are or whatever. I'm sure his politics aren't my politics, but at like a basic level, that's what he's saying there. And yeah, I thought that was one of the reasons I wanted to like see this movie with you, was like that exact scene.
Totally punctures the myth of American innocence. You know, if you were ever under any illusions about the innocence of Americans abroad and even American soldiers and Marines abroad, like it's like we're all fucked up. It's all fucked up, and they didn't even know what they were doing there. You know,
Yeah.
there was one of the guys was asked the purpose. There, like the camera guy or Lagoze, he was asking the guy on camera like, "So what are we doing here?" And the guy was like, gave a non answer where he sort of trailed off and was like, well, we're trying to build up relations with the locals. But then of course cut to a scene where it's like they're, you know, humiliating a guy out in a field with his pants down, but got him at gunpoint and all this shit, screaming at the kids, you know, everybody's fucking Taliban, like all that stuff, you know. And it's like, is that building relations with the locals, you know?
Yeah, I think that might, if I remember correctly, that might have been one of the officers. I think so. He's trying to get like an official interview with one of the officers that I imagine could then, that kind of officer interview could then be sent up to, you know, Barbara Starr at CNN. There's that one scene. It's a segment with Barbara Starr, who was one of the prominent, you know, Pentagon. She was the Pentagon reporter for CNN throughout the War on Terror. And was basically just pushing out 24/7 propaganda. And that's actually another really good scene where they show some of the bit from his footage. And then I don't know if you noticed this, man, but she gets his name wrong. She says, you know, and this footage comes from Jacob Lagoze. I'm pretty sure she said Jacob Lagoze instead of Miles Lagoze. And I don't know if he included that footage in part because she gets his name wrong, but like, I also think that's so perfect. Like this person does not give a shit.
You don't matter. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's fucked.
There's one other thing, another scene. I just want to like go boom, 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 and just go through all these amazing scenes.
Yeah. Oh, let me just say real quick on that fucking CNN thing. One thing that annoyed me about that, it reminded me, I would like this was back in like 2011, 2012 when that was just being shown, you know. I remember seeing these like snippets of like those exact scenes of combat footage from the combat cameraman on things like CNN, and just like it showed on the film, it was totally like decontextualized violence. You know, and I guess that's part of the nature of like having it be propaganda, but it's like I would see that stuff even at the time when I was like still all in on that mission, but thinking like, what the fuck? Like what am I watching? Literally, you know? Like all I'm seeing is action, but like action in what context? What's the purpose, you know? And it's like really frustrating. And it's like amazing that that dominated news coverage for so long. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, or either it's like just totally decontextualized violence, or I think what even makes it worse is that they try to contextualize it in like a just so story or a kind of convenient narrative about
Innocence kind of way.
Yeah, or like, you know, this violence is taking place, you know, they're in a really heated battle right now in order to take over this particular part of the country in order to do this. And then once they do this, you know, we'll be able to do this. And, you know, this kind of hopeful narrative, which again, like it was his job as a combat cameraman to like push out these propaganda narratives, like all this violence, like it was all about like attaching a purpose to this aimless, totally purposeless violence, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was his job. And in fact, the whole movie is all the things that didn't fit conveniently into these narratives that he was tasked with manufacturing.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't help but bring up Phil Cly because it's an interesting kind of comparison.
Oh, yeah.
Phil Cly was a public affairs officer. He's written some of the best books about the war on terror, in my opinion. I have a lot of problems politically with redeployment, but he's a hell of a writer. And there's a lot of good writing, and also he bases his writing on just endless interviews with a lot of frontline guys, interviews that he conducted as a public affairs officer, interviews he conducted after he was a public affairs officer. He wrote another book, his first novel called Missionaries, which again, and that's actually like, Clyde's whole thing is about like not being political or being above politics, and I think you and I would both agree that there's
no
an
such
implied
thing.
politics to a lot of that, and it'd be nice if he was more self-aware about his own politics. But it's I would say it's a good book. It's worth reading. But it is interesting. There is a real kind of aesthetic, kind of like visceral contrast between Lagoze and Cly. And interestingly, like Lagoze in the book that he just wrote, I might have missed it, but I don't think he got any accolade. He didn't get an accolade from Cly, but he got an accolade from like all the other war and terror authors. Again, like Sebastian Junger, Elliot Ackerman, other guys. And I don't know if he asked Cly. I don't know if Cly is doing those types of accolades. I have no idea what the backstory is. But, you know, it made me think about, I'm kind of curious what Cly would think of that movie, and if he's brought it up at all, if he's seen it. To me, like so much of what Cly was doing in his earlier career was still trying to do that mission of like selling. Like, I think he went from selling the war, which was his job as a public affairs officer, to even when he got out, it was about like selling. It was still about selling the troops. You know, like there was a exchange he had with an academic about, you know, an academic was writing all this stuff about how the troops are overrepresented in mass shootings and overrepresented in all sorts of violence and
it's just a fact. Yeah.
And he intervened in this debate and basically saying this is harmful to troops. This is unfair to them. A lot of troops aren't violent. You know, they all need to get jobs and all the rest. And like, you know, and I think he's maybe moved away from that a bit. But I feel like Lagoze is an interesting counterpoint to that. Like Lagoze got out. He was not only was he no longer interested in selling the war, he was not at all interested in selling the troops. And I think like what makes this movie unique in a way is that there's, you know, even though there's those moments where you and I, like, we find these guys really endearing and, you know, it kind of triggers a lot of like,
we can see ourselves in them a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Like at the end of the day, like these guys are fucked up, just like we were fucked up. And, you know, and a lot of them have been through a lot of shit, you know, throughout their lives. And I don't know, I'm going off on a tangent now, but
that's the point, man.
Yeah.
There's a selfish element to this show where it's like a kind of catharsis for us, you know, like working through it. There's a couple like background things I wanted to pull on like Lagoze interviews before we go, but are there any juicy quotes that we missed that you captured? Because again, it's like super quotable movie. I kind of don't want to miss if there's
so after the soccer game, you have more. He has this section where he shows the Marines trying to do counterinsurgency. Like the soccer game is part of that, and then after that, you have this good old boy, Southern boy, talking to these kids, being like, and he's got a terp in between him, like trying to translate, and he's like, "End war, coloring book, draw a dog," and like. And he's like, these kids have no idea what he's saying. Even like when it gets translated, they're still like, what? Like, why is he saying end war? Like this guy is like doing a war. like what is he talking about?
He was saying it so aggressively too. Like if you just don't know what he was saying, it sounds like he's making some dominating demand of you, you know?
Exactly. Well, that's another brilliant thing about that fucking scene is that you can tell he doesn't want to be doing this. And he's almost mocking like what he's doing while he's doing it. Like, he knows this is bullshit. And some higher up told him he has to do this, probably his lieutenant. So he's doing it. He doesn't want to do it. He knows it's dumb. It was another very revealing moment.
Yeah, it's nuts. Like watching this whole thing, especially with the literal desire to get into firefights and just blow shit up at a certain point. It just reminded me that, like, going back to the imperial domination thing, the imperial violence, I don't know if there's if we or anybody is more capable of doing an antiseptic military occupation than what we did there. Like, I don't know that it could be any cleaner than what we did. And that is an absolute condemnation in my mind. Like, I'm not saying that as a vindication. It's like, that's fucked. You can't do war and you can't do counterinsurgency and you can't do military occupation without tons of fucking blowback. Oh, fuck, we shot a shopkeeper. Oh, we need to hide the body. Oh, we have to humiliate 30% of the fucking men in this country. Like, can you do these counterinsurgencies and stuff?
Wrong house. Yeah, boy.
Yeah. Yeah. Blow up the wrong shit. Do you think it's possible to do a counterinsurgency campaign where that shit doesn't happen? Like you said, your direct experience. It's like you couldn't weigh in, you couldn't intervene when you were a new guy. The path of least resistance was to not report shit up the chain most of the time, and like once something becomes like on the record and the paperwork that goes into that and the business processes that get activated because you put some information into the system, it's like it's not fucking worth it. The whole system grinds to a halt. And so like I just like I'm not convinced. I think the liberal, like the well-meaning liberal, thinks that we can like see these deficiencies in how we did the war and correct for them. And I like my view is like we can only correct for this by making sure we don't do this, making sure that we don't have to do this. Like you're not going to tinker on the edges of how we conduct an operation and then make it go from unacceptable to acceptable. Like there's going to be all kinds of bad shit unleashed every time we do something like this. And you can't avoid it. It's good to try to minimize it. It's best to avoid it altogether. I don't know what you think about that, but.
Well, obviously I agree. There's a book, Sam Moyne's book, Humane, which is all about this, which I reviewed. And his argument is basically that we've never seen more military interventions. I don't know if it's a plurality or a majority, but like a shocking number of our military interventions have come after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Since
half. There's a new data set about this. Half of 400 military interventions since the founding of the Republic. Half since the fucking unipolar moment started.
Yes. And this all coincided with the rise of international humanitarian law, particularly as it applies to, legally justifiable or defensible violence, state violence, war. And the war on terror, there's a lot of different ways you can approach it. But one thing that makes the war on terror unique is that it was impeccably legalistic. Like Obama's guys, there's been so much written about all the lawyers that surrounded Obama at all times. He himself was a lawyer, like all our politicians are lawyers, except for, thank God, our vice presidential candidate right now, Tim Walz, the first one in decades not to be a lawyer. But and how this kind of thinking, like as long as we can like legally justify this violence, therefore it's in fact morally justifiable, that just opens the floodgates for endless aimless war. And there's a famous argument made by Tolstoy, which Moyne writes. Tolstoy is kind of the hero of his book, which Tolstoy argued that we're better off just having like barbaric war than this kind of legalistically justified war, because at least the barbarism is something that we can react against, and we can see the evil for what it actually is. He has this famous line about that kind of legal warfare is like a vegetarian, or not what is it? A meat eater who just asked that the actual slaughter of the beef doesn't happen like immediately before them or something. It's much more eloquent than this.
Yeah.
But And I think Tolstoy was more or less right. I'm not, this is not an argument for returning to barbaric war. And I think what makes that book interesting is like, you're kind of left kind of unsure about, does this mean that we should give up on the idea of like legal constrictions to warfare? I don't think we should. I think like it still matters on the margins.
Yeah.
But I think we need to become far more aware of this dynamic that has actually been happening, where once war becomes legalized, it becomes endless and it becomes justifiable in virtually any context, particularly on the part of powerful countries, imperial countries.
Yeah. Man, this is fucked. Lagoze gave a couple interviews that I just want to like pull from some quotes or get your reaction. One is he talked to the Daily Beast and he said, quote, "The whole aspect of being at war for 20 years has made such an impact on American society and American culture. What we wear, the guns, the flak jackets, the helmets. You look at January 6th, these guys were totally tacked up. I knew guys who were at January 6th from my unit. There's no graceful way to lose a war, but I feel like the thing that most Americans were upset about was the optics and how it looked, because no one gave a shit about the war for 20 years. It's the longest war in American history, and nobody cared about it until we pulled out." Thoughts? Feel some type of way?
Well, first of all, I mean, and I think we do need to wrap up. So this is kind of like a thematic wrap up here. But
Yeah.
that word "pullout" is another sexual term,
There we
withdraw,
go.
pullout. And in the context of this war and the guys that are fighting this war, there's nothing worse than pulling out, right?
Yeah,
Like,
true.
yeah, I mean, we're a country that could care less. And I hate the rape metaphors, for a variety of reasons, but it's just unavoidable. You cannot talk about war, and you certainly can't talk about imperialist war without talking about the rapaciousness of it, and just how it's all it just is, especially if you've been there, on either end, particularly if you've been on the receiving end. It's a mass rape. And what I think the greatest indictment of our society is that we can't see the mass rape, but we get really upset if we pull out. I mean, and we could laugh about it. I mean, there's something maybe like darkly funny about that, but I mean, that was what was so fucked up about the reaction to the Afghanistan withdrawal. Don't get me wrong. Like, I was among like basically all the veterans that served in Afghanistan who thought like the way Biden talked about the Afghans, the way he justified withdrawing, you could tell he didn't give a shit about all these Afghans. A lot of, including the ones that served beside us and who had targets on their own back as a result of that. He could care less about any of them. So I have a lot of criticisms about both how the withdrawal was messaged and then how it was conducted. But I don't think most Americans gave a shit about those details or those niceties. They and again, this is mostly elite reaction.
Yeah.
The elites were very upset that we were ending this war, and they could care less about this war that was going on for 20 years otherwise.
None of it mattered on its own terms. It was all about what does this communicate to our like allies and adversaries in the fictional order that we've built up in our imaginations. There's a narrative about American power and how America relates to the world, and like the Afghanistan war was like one little piece in that crown, one little jewel in it that like made their story just so, but it wasn't so, and like the fiction, there was a fiction the whole time, which is part of how we got here. Like it's funny that Combat Obscura comes out in 2018, and it's such an indictment of the war, the purposelessness of it, the grotesqueness of it, of war without purpose. And it's around that time, I think, maybe you can date it earlier, but like popular opinion against the war was turning around that time, you know? So like this was kind of speaking to a zeitgeist, I guess. And then 2 years later, of course, you know, we actually pull out 3 years later.
Yeah. You know, and just one more thing I wanted to say, because you were talking about like the elite reaction. I mean, this narrative, I mean, this continues, even though they ended up being wrong about all their predictions about, I mean, the Taliban took over and the Taliban is brutal, but the Taliban was already in control of basically the entire country outside of Kabul anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
The government that we had in Kabul was an incredibly corrupt, violent government in itself. The war that we were prosecuting, that government was prosecuting, but mostly our government was prosecuting, was absolutely devastating for the overwhelming majority of Afghans.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the best reporting coming out of Afghanistan, you know, Anand Gopal is the best example of this, but you have other reporters as well. You know, makes clear that the Afghans as a whole are very grateful that war is over. You know, and so they were wrong about that. They were wrong about their predictions. And yet, even to this day, the kind of elite narrative now is that because of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, Putin ended up invading Ukraine. October 7th ended up happening. I mean,
yeah, stab in the back myth kind of bullshit. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. It's totally this reactionary right-wing narrative. You know, this presumption that any moment of doing anything other than like warring and showing violent strength is a sign of weakness and encourages more violence. You know, and if you want to make that argument, fine, make the argument, but the argument is never actually made. It's an assertion that's made.
Yeah.
And there's never really any like rigorous argument for how or why like Putin would have never actually invaded Ukraine if we were still in Afghanistan, or Hamas and PFLP and PIJ and the other groups involved with October 7th, that they would have never conducted their operation without the withdrawal. It's just kind of this vacuous assertion that we hear again and again.
Yep. True story. Would you recommend this movie? I think yes. I mean, you.
Yeah, I mean, I have. Yeah.
All right.
2 thumbs up.
Thumbs up. There we go. Yeah. All right, man. Well, this
How
was an awesome.
Would you recommend it?
Yes, but not as like, not just to watch casually. I would recommend it less for entertainment purposes and more for almost. It's almost like anti-imperial PR, anti-imperial propaganda. The good kind of propaganda. So like it's the like, Jesus Christ, this is what war is actually like. And we're going to talk about a ton of movies in this show that don't necessarily depict war realistically, that do depict war heroically. And hopefully we'll have critiques ready for that. But like this goes in the totally opposite direction. And so I almost feel like this was a perfect movie to start as like planting a flag about closer to what we're about with the show. I don't know, but great choice. Yeah.
Yeah, man. Well, I really appreciated this. I hope our listeners did too. And I look forward to many such occasions in the future.
That's right. So the episode the website's bangbangpod.com. You should be able to find this wherever podcasts are. And we'll have a paid subscription possibility soon if we don't already. TBD on all of that. But bangbangpod.com. Follow us on the socials and review us, like us, because we need it because we're a new podcast. Okay. All right. All right, man. This was fun and cathartic.
Yeah.
All right.